It was the final battle of the European theatre of the Second World War. When the Soviet Red Army arrived close to the gates of Berlin, they had already sent thousands of pieces of artillery crashing upon the black heart of the Third Reich. At this point, Hitler was still inside of his underground complex of bunkers, and he was trying with whatever might he could to muster troops to repel the advancing Soviets, and he even sent children into battle against the bloodthirsty Red Army, who wanted to put the capital of Hitler's empire to the sword. What happened in roughly 16 days of bombardment and brutality still scars Berlin to this day, and there are still many mysteries as to what happened to people as they disappeared at the hands of the fighting forces. Hitler inside of his bunker knew that the war was lost, and he made arrangements for his demise and death. But there were many horrors and terrors that plagued Berlin during the battle, and it was a harrowing and terrifying part of the conflict, and it brought an end to the Third Reich, an empire that had caused and led to the slaughter of millions of people. Welcome to the Untold Past. Today we look at the unspeakable terror of the Battle of Berlin. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. On the 20th of April 1945, whilst Hitler was inside of his bunker celebrating his 56th birthday, the Soviet artillery from the 1st Belarusian front began to pound the city of Berlin. The artillery and bombs did not stop hitting the city until the surrender came weeks later. The weight of the bombs that were sent crashing by the Soviet Red Army was more than the total tonnage of the bombs dropped by Allied bombers on the city, and for the Soviets this was a statement. They targeted the heart of the governmental headquarters and various different parts of the city, and thousands of people died inside of their homes and flats, which were struck by artillery fire, and there were many people who sheltered inside underground stations. Even Hitler regularly heard shells dropping inside of the Reich Chancellery garden, whilst he was holed up inside of his bunker deep underground. The artillery caused chaos, and the water, gas and electricity service in the city was broken, and Berliners had little food, and they had to cook half-rotten potatoes on fires from their own balconies, as they were worried about the bombs that were falling. Much of the city was closed also due to the bombardment, which was also coming from the sky. Against the strength of the Red Army, there was little to no chance for the remaining parts of the German army to defend the capital. There were a few King Tiger tanks, who did manage to knock out some parts of Soviet offensive vehicles, but they could do very little. Inside of Berlin, there were people who were queuing up for rations, which were being given out, or they were queuing up for water at pumps, and they were then hit by the artillery. People even began to bury their valuables in their gardens and basements to protect them, and they knew things were very bad. There was also a breakdown in law and order, and the people of the city began to turn to looting as things got very desperate, and people were starving. Stalled trains were broken into, as were shops, and looting was considered a capital offence if captured, and people could be executed if they were unlucky enough to be caught. Some even carved up the remains of dead horses and animals that had been shot in the fighting around the city, and this for many was their only source of fresh meat. Hitler had ordered the creation of the Volkssturm, a civilian militia who were involved in defending Berlin, and in this there were very young children who were bearing arms to take the fight to the Soviets. All able-bodied males were pressed to fight the enemy by the Nazis, and anyone who was seen to be fleeing or who refused to defend Berlin on the front lines was subjected to being targeted for being shot or hanged on the spot by SS executioners and death squads who roamed around the streets looking for these people who were considered deserters. At many different bridges, there were thousands of boys wearing uniforms which were miles too big for them, and helmets for adults which covered and obscured their vision, as they were far too big. But thousands of these boys had been members of the Hitler Youth, and those who had not were killed in the battle. The final public appearance of Hitler on his 56th birthday, the 20th of April 1945, saw him make a short trip out of the bunker to award children medals of the Iron Cross for their bravery during the fighting. Many of these went back to fighting straight after. Many of these boys were also left without leadership, especially as Hitler Youth leader Arthur Axmann abandoned his post and fled towards the Alps. But whilst this was all happening, there was terror and bloodshed inside Hitler's bunker. The Führer bunker was where Hitler had established his final Führer headquarters since January 1945. There were a string of deaths inside the bunker, and some of these were incredibly tragic. Many inside the bunker had realised that by April 1945 that they had to make a decision, either leave the bunker or remain encased inside of it forever, or face arrest by the Soviets. Hitler had made his decision, and he, along with his new wife, Eva Hitler, formerly Eva Braun, would die within the bunker's complex on the 30th of April 1945, inside specifically his study, whilst he was sat on the sofa. But others who were loyal took matters into their own hands. Joseph Goebbels, a minister of propaganda, and appointed Chancellor of Nazi Germany upon Hitler's death, and the Third Reich, went the same way with his wife inside the garden of the Reich Chancellery, either consuming a cyanide capsule or using gunshot. These bodies were then burned inside the garden within a bomb crater, and Hitler's body was much more successfully burned than that of the Goebbels couple, as their bodies were later discovered and were even detectable as to who they were. But the couple had also murdered their own children within the Führer bunker, as they'd been dosed up with morphine and then cyanide. The Soviets would later find their children in their beds days later. A couple of generals also took their lives before breakouts were attempted. This chaos and feeling within an underground complex was echoed across the city, and some of the most ferocious fighting took place around the Reichstag, the former governmental building. Soviet shells pounded the region, and it was defended by 10,000 men, including many SS people, and they had been trapped and encircled by the Soviets, and the Germans fought with despair and courage, and they fought to the very end. The Soviets were devoted to try and take the building by force, and the defenders, armed with Panzerfaust and other weapons, fired them towards the Soviets, and did whatever they could, and the casualties around the Reichstag were terrible. The Soviets threw thousands of grenades and fired their way through, gunning down anyone no matter their age. It was a long slog, which was immensely costly, and of course it resulted in a Soviet red banner being hoisted from the Reichstag. But much of the horror which took place inside of the city was caused by the brutality and barbarism of the Soviet Red Army. Berlin was only lit by burning buildings due to the power being knocked out, and some SS men tried to hide out wherever they could, but civilians deemed soldiers as a danger to them, even those on their side, as they knew the Soviets would try to execute anyone close to a German soldier or anyone who belonged to their enemy. They became a danger to people who were hiding out, and nurses inside of casualty stations even took weapons off people they treated, as they were worried about the Soviet soldiers entering the hospitals and executing anyone in sight. But the women of Berlin had a huge terror coming for them in the form of the Soviet soldiers. They had heard about their fearsome reputation, and they conducted, it's believed, 100,000 or more assaults upon women who lived in the city. The women were seen in the eyes of the Soviets as spoils of war, who were there to be taken, and the Soviets believed they could do whatever they wanted. One terrified woman who was in Berlin claimed that, the next morning we women proceeded to make ourselves look as unattractive as possible to the Soviets by smearing our faces with coal dust and covering our heads with old rags, our makeup for the Ivan. We huddled together in the central part of the basement, shaking with fear, while some peeked through the low basement windows to see what was happening on the Soviet-controlled street. We felt paralysed by the sight of those husky Mongolians, looking wild and frightening. At the ruin across the street from us, the first Soviet orders were posted, including a curfew. Suddenly there was a shattering noise outside. Horrified, we watched the Soviets demolish a corner grocery store and throw its contents, shelving and furniture, out onto the street. The Red Army were causing terror all across the city, and another woman said, "The frontline Russian troops who did the fighting, as a woman, you did not have to be afraid of them. They shot every man they saw, even old men and young boys, but they left the women alone. It was the ones who came afterwards, the second echelon, who were the worst. They did all the assaulting and plundering. They stripped homes of every single possession, right down to the toilet." There were parts of the city which were raided by the Soviets looking for women, and they conducted terrifying actions inside of an orphanage, in which they subjected nuns and even women who had just given birth to terrifying ordeals, and many were killed in this. One woman, who was just 24 years old, claimed she was ripped from a cupboard, where she was hiding by a soldier from the Soviet Union, and she tried to make things easy for herself, promising to be his girlfriend. However, he introduced her to his other soldiers, and her ordeal was made worse. There was death everywhere, and the bodies of German defenders and also Red Army soldiers who had been killed in battle were left out everywhere, and some were buried inside mass graves, but the clean-up operation took months after the war. There were some people who tried to get out of the city, but some, including Hitler's personal secretary Martin Bormann, met a bloody end, but these stories have took decades to be uncovered. At the end of the Battle of Berlin, there had almost been 1 million Soviet injured and losses, and roughly 360,000 German casualties and losses, but there were roughly 125,000 civilians who had also been killed. It was a huge bloodbath within the city, and much of it had been reduced to rubble. For the advancing Red Army soldiers, they believed that this was retribution and revenge for the brutality of Operation Barbarossa, and they thought that they could at least inflict terror and horror onto the capital of Hitler's empire. Still today there are many lost souls whose stories from the battle have not been uncovered. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.